Welcome back, everyone. Today we're gonna be making a pumpkin sweatshirt, and we're gonna be transforming it from just a standard sweatshirt. I'm gonna be showing you a few different methods. It's a super easy project, and it also comes with the free pattern. So grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started supplies, you'll need a 1/4 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a sherpa, a fleece, a sweatshirt fleece, pretty much any type of fabric that's a little bit thicker and has some stretch. So think of it this way, you wanna pair your fabric with the shirt you're using. So if you're using a sweatshirt, you're gonna wanna find a fabric that's about that same thickness. And I'm gonna be using a sweater fabric for method 1, and for method 2, I'm gonna be using a sherpa. But like always, test different fabrics, let me know in the comments, and find the fabric that's unique for your look. And lastly, you'll need your pattern. It's a free pattern. It's available at properfitclothing.com. The link is in the description below. All you have to do is download it, print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. Real quick, before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. Once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. After taping the pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results. The pattern comes in 2 sizes and can easily be adjusted. After cutting, you should end up with 1 mouthpiece. For method 1, include the seam allowance, and for method 2, cut on the dotted line. I also went ahead and scaled mine up to the size of the shirt. This is very easy to do, just scale it proportionally. You'll need 1 nose panel cut out of your main fabric, and again, this panel is very easy to adjust. All you have to do is scale it up for a larger size. And lastly, you'll need 2 eye panels cut out of your main fabric. We're going to be starting with method 1, and this is the method where we sew the face under the sweatshirt. And it's best to scale up just a little bit for this technique because we're going to be sewing under and we're going to be losing a little bit to the seam allowance. So if you're looking for a bigger face, I recommend scaling it up to counter the seam allowance. And this is something you can play around with to get that perfect sizing. Before we sew the face on, we want to give the sweatshirt a little bit of style. And what I'm going to do is try to add the pumpkin curves onto the sweatshirt. So I'm going to fold it up like an accordion, starting with the sleeve and working my way towards the center. As I'm doing this, I'm trying to curve it a little bit so that way it flows with the side and acts like a shape of a pumpkin. Once you get to the center for one side, repeat it for the opposite side. Grab a few rubber bands and lock everything into position by placing a few at the top and a few in the midsection. Since this is a darker sweatshirt, I'm going to be using bleach to pull out a little bit of that color. Typically, you could use a dye kit, but for this one, we're going to be using bleach. I'm going to be using a dripper bottle with a finer tip. This will allow me to go along the folds and reduce the amount of splash. If you are working inside, I recommend covering your table and wearing a face mask. I'm also just using straight bleach, no water to bleach ratio. This is a 60-50 cotton polyester blend. And over the years, I found that using just straight bleach works best when working with the polyester cotton blend. If I was working with 100% cotton, then I'd mix a little bit of water in so I didn't burn directly through the fabric. As you can see, it kind of bubbles up on top, so all you have to do with gloves, kind of pat it into the fabric, get it on all the folds. Once everything is covered, you're going to let it sit for about 1 to 2 hours, kind of monitor it and see how light you want to go. Next, give it a full cycle wash, dry it off, and see how it turned out. Mine didn't turn out exactly perfect. There are better techniques for doing this and getting a better shape, but with a little bit of practice, it could be looking nice. Next, we're going to place the face on the front side of the sweatshirt with right side facing up. Once you figured out the placement of the face, we're going to be using chalk to chalk around the outside edges. This will give us a guideline when we're placing those face panels on the inside of the sweatshirt. So before you start chalking, just make sure you have the placement correct. After you have all the face panels chalked out, you can take them off and you can start placing them on the inside of the sweatshirt with right side facing up. And remember, we are lining them up with the chalked out areas. It may take a little bit of adjusting, moving them around to get them in the right spot, and once you do, you're going to want to place a few pins and pull the wrong sides of the sweatshirt out. From here, we're going to stitch on the outside of the face panel at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And take your time, go slow, try to make it as neat as possible, and I recommend using a thread color that matches your fabric color to hide any imperfections. After sewing, the next step is to cut out that top layer of sweatshirt, and there's a few different ways you can do this. You can cut fully around the outside edge and open up each panel fully, or you can kind of make a design and make it look like the face is ripping through the fabric, and that's what I'm going to be doing. Before I start cutting, I'm going to grab a piece of chalk and kind of mark out the design of how I want to cut the fabric layer. I'm going to be leaving a few strands in the eyes, the nose, and in the mouth. Again, this step is not mandatory. You can fully cut each panel out, but I want to give it just that little bit of extra design. And from here, we're going to cut that top layer out. Remember not to cut all the way through the second layer. And another thing I like to do is to cut about a 1/4 inch away from the stitch, because over time that fabric will roll and kind of hide that thread. And once you finish cutting out all the inside fabric, double check all the corners and the stitching, make sure everything is looking good. If you chose to add the strands, the next step is going to be sewing those down so they're not flopping around. You can leave them unstitched, but I noticed they get caught on things and over time they kind of stretch and start to droop down. So I found the easiest solution to that is sew directly in the center of each strand. And remember to sew across the entire strand. After locking everything down, your sweater is complete. And this technique is super fun to do with just regular t-shirts. You can put anything behind there and have it kind of pop out that face. The possibilities are endless, and you can also transfer this into different holidays. All right, next we're going to be moving on to method 2. In this one, we're going to be adding the face directly on top. Before we do that, we do want to give this a little bit of design, and we're going to be folding the sides in like an accordion and adding dye. I'm just using a standard die kit that you can buy at the store. It's super simple and easy to use. And to get those pumpkin creases, I'm going to be folding the sides in like an accordion, adding a few rubber bands. Essentially, I'm using the same technique as I did in the previous method, but for this one, we're going to be using a dye instead of bleach. If you're working inside, cover your table and use a face mask. I'll be using a red so it stands out on the orange. I'm also going to be trying to get it directly on top of each one of those folds. The more you use, the more the shirt will change from orange to red, and I'm trying to not make it all red. I'm trying to make it mostly orange, so I'm using as little as possible. The color turned out very faint, and that's exactly what I was going for. I wanted some nice, subtle lines. So if you want yours more dynamic, you can add more dye or switch it up and add bleach. From here, we're going to start placing the face panels on the front side of the sweatshirt with right sides facing up, and it might take a little bit of moving them around to get them in the right location. I'm going to be using a basic fabric glue to adhere them down so they're not moving around as I try to sew them on. You can also use just pins and sew them on from there, but I like using the glue to really lock everything down. It just makes it a little bit easier when you go to sew. If you are using an adhesive, you're going to want to let it sit for a little while so it doesn't get gunked up in your sewing machine. Once everything is dry, we're going to stitch around the outside edge of each panel directly on top of the edge. And I'm using a wider zigzag stitch so I can hit the edge of the panel and also the sweatshirt. In the end, it helps clean up that raw edge and prevents any fraying if you're using a fabric that frays. But keep in mind, if you don't have a zigzag stitch, you could still use a regular straight stitch. But after you finish stitching, your sweater is complete. And again, the possibilities with this technique are endless as well. You can use different types of fabric, different articles of clothing. So I recommend playing around with it and making something that's unique to you. And there you have it, your pumpkin sweaters are complete. It's a super easy and fun project. I would love to see what fabric you use, so tag me on Instagram at ProperFitClothing. But until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.